I'm the owner of...
And I want to push my friend Michelle Assad's new book, Getting Off the Episode. Michelle and her husband work with CIA.
As we would call it, but where would you rather be than on a beach than maybe with my boys doing some unauthorized history podcast?
There you go. So as I was saying, this is the last episode of season 4. This is episode 442. Yeah, 142, but that's just what we're saying. This is, with the next few weeks that are coming up, we got a couple placeholder episodes that Bill and I start to prepare for the next season, season 5, and the first episode of season 5 will be in several weeks. We're doing this now. So Sean, this is Q&A, final Q&A of this season. You got the helm, baby. All you.
Commodore, do I have the con?
You have the con.
So in the future, as always, I always say, 2-3 sentences, get to the point, tell me who you are, and what I also like is tell me where you're ranked from. We'd like to know where the audience is, you know? So if you're in Siberia, you know, say, hey, I'm in Siberia. So that's always a neat little aspect to it.
So hey, before we get started, because this is a Pacific Northwest show, I need to point out that both John and I are drinking Mai Tais. So the last episode we drank, or the Q&A episode, we drank the same facts. These are Mai Tais. Yes, I don't know about your recipe, John, but mine's the original 1944 recipe, so I'm going full throttle.
You make your own oreo syrup?
As I usually do, but I do not this time.
Okay, well then I have the moral high ground. Mine is homemade oreo syrup.
Yeah, what kind of rum did you use, though?
Rum's it's 4 different rums in this, I'll let you know.
So
Most of them, it's fine, whatever. I've got 3 different kinds of plantation, and then a little lemon heart 151 mixed in here as well. Yeah.
I got 2 shots of Martinique, 2 shots of Myers, and 3 orgeat, and then of course lime juice and orange curacao.
Yep. That sounds very similar to what we're doing here.
So it's a goodie. It's a goodie. All right.
So
John,
first question is, what is your favorite rum?
I like the Plantation 20th anniversary for sipping. My wife is also very fond of Eldorado 12 year. I make old fashions that are half bourbon, half Eldorado 12 year, and they're quite yummy. Sad.
There is a sort of halfway Cuban rum called Matusado, and it's a dark, very, very, very sugary rum. I'm not a really sugary drink kind of a guy because I call it headache juice. Just instant. That's why I don't drink margaritas. But it is a good sipper. It is a really super smooth. I mean, it's like you're drinking cane syrup. It's
Not too funky.
No, not at all. Not at all. Doesn't have a stank to it.
Okay.
It's pretty tasty. You find out. Anyway.
All right.
When I was in the Navy, my World Navy, I used to push oil muscles on me.
Yeah, pretty strong. I can't deal with that. Gotta say.
I developed the taste. Not saying this. Some people say I developed the taste for it. They were overindulging. I was not. But there's this rum from Barbados that I have downstairs. It's like sipping rum. It's really good. You refrigerate it, kind of like good bulk red wine. But I can't really leave them. It's the old quaint.
There we go. All right, let's do this thing. Basic question.
I mean, I like Zion 12. That's me, but slow your roll, John. I'm in charge.
Sorry.
Let's go.
I do. What you have gone?
Yeah. All right. Dave from Bryan, Texas asks, gentlemen, one of the things Admiral King has been criticized for is not allocating enough escort ships to protect ships in the Atlantic after the U.S. joined the war well into 1942. How would it affect U.S. efforts in the Pacific, especially the Guadalcanal campaign, if Admiral King had sent more DDs and DIAs into the Atlantic? Love your show. Hope to get to see at least some of you at the Nimitz Museum's annual symposium in 2025.
Ready for your first egg, Bow Wow?
Oh, nice. What's it like?
It's the best. You meet so many friends. We romp and play, have fun with camp counselors, and snuggle in the cozy cabins, eating Even take fancy baths.
Boy, that does sound good.
I have an answer for that, but go ahead.
I wanted to talk about Paukenschlag. In fact, Seth will confirm that I've sent him texts on Paukenschlag. Let's talk about Paukenschlag. I don't think the king was in any position to send any more escorts to the Pacific. He had a hair on fire emergency on the Atlantic and was desperate for as many escorts as he could get there. My biggest beef around the whole portrayal of Paukenschlag, which tends to be very anti-king, obviously, it's kind of a tanker holocaust on the East Coast, but a lot of that criticism tends to come from British authors, and like Michael Gannon, who wrote Operation Drumbeat, which I thought was just amazing, sensationalist garbage.
I thought it was a good, that one or Torpedo Junction. I'm thinking of Torpedo Junction. That's an amazing.
Okay. The bottom line is the king had a lot of things that he had to get done in the first half of 1942. He had a lot of balls in the air, and one of the most important of those was to escort troop transports that were going over to Britain, because the British were screaming bloody murder. We need your troops in the UK as rapidly as possible, because we are shipping troops out to the Mideast and the Far East because the barn's on fire. And what ends up happening then is that we're sending these troop convoys over. They are very heavily escorted because King makes a deliberate decision that, I can accept a slow dribble of drowned merchant mariners, but I absolutely cannot accept a drowned regiment of American boys on board one of these transports, and therefore those convoys are going to be guarded within an inch of their life. In many cases, we're sending our old battleships along with them to make sure that people like Gneisenau and Scharnhorst don't show up. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's happening here is that the British are also creating a number of obligations for us in the form of, we need North Carolina and Wasp up in Scapa Flow because the Turbot's is big and scary and our KGB class don't really match up well against her. Can you guys come, mind the shop while we're off doing things like capturing Madagascar and stuff like that. And so I think a lot of that gets lost to observers. That this is a coalition war. We have partners that are trying to pick up the slack for our other partners. That's how you play a coalition war. And I think it is very ungenerous of a lot of the British observers out there not to give King his due. That he's doing crazy things like running the Wasp into the Mediterranean, dump off Spitfires at Malta and crap like that. You guys are creating a lot of commitments for our ships, our big ships, all of which require escorts. And if I didn't have those commitments, maybe those destroyers might have been in a better position to actually escort some of our convoys. I will ding King for not implementing convoying on a limited basis for tankers, perhaps a month or so earlier than he did. But part of that is also due to the fact that we really didn't have a good understanding for what Paukenschlag was in the beginning. It could have just been a PR stunt by Jonas. I'm going to send a couple of boats over to say, shoot things up and, raise holy hell. We didn't really understand until almost March. And my God, this is a sustained effort on the part of the Kriegsmarine, and they really have figured out how to get boats over here to do things on a sustained basis. And so I give King a B plus, maybe, for his handling of that whole episode. It was ugly, but, we accepted the losses and we moved on. And I really think that he did just about as well as he could have done. Seth?
I agree with that 100%. And Bill and I have actually talked about this multiple times. Is it King is crucified because a bunch of tankers and cargo ships and whatnot get sunk during the happy time, or the second happy time? But regardless of this, he also could only do what he could with what he had to and he's trying to fight into ocean, which, oh, by the way, our main battle force, with the exception obviously of the aircraft carriers, has been destroyed in the Pacific, so we don't have a whole lot to fight with. And as you said, He's got a lot of balls in the air. So he's trying to juggle what he can with what he has, which is not as much as people assume that we had at the time. And the fact that, as you said perfectly well, Washington goes, but freaking Washington, the nautical assassin, goes and runs North Atlantic service along with Wasp, along with later on South Dakota and the brand spanking new Alabama before they ever go to, I mean, South Dakota goes to the Pacific, comes back, but Alabama goes out to the Atlantic before she ever goes to the Pacific to do this very thing. We needed those ships in the Pacific. That's all you need to know right there. Because, I mean, you're sending capital ships to do work in the Atlantic when they were, frankly, especially for the American war effort, were needed far more in the Pacific at the time.
I will absolutely grant that the British, and I talk about this extensively in my 1942 book, so that, thank you for giving me this question. It's like, I just love to blather about this. The British had already gone through the first happy time, and their exports have been cut down dramatically. The larder was not very full in the UK at this point in time. There are things like fuel stocks, food stocks have been drawn down pretty drastically, so there wasn't a lot of buffer play here. And, the fact that the second happy time takes off, and as Roger Witt, who was the commander of the British submarine tracking group, puts it, the problem is, Admiral, a lot of these ships that are going down aren't yours, they're ours. So, from the British perspective, Falkenschlag was an absolute air-on-fire emergency, and they were pressing every panic button they could because they could not afford to watch their imports die again. So I get it, but I just feel that ex post facto, there has not been a very balanced or nuanced treatment of just all of the various commitments that our Navy and their Navy had to meet. It wasn't just submarines going on here. There's a lot of other stuff happening too.
I think something else too that people fail to understand is that, when the United States goes to war, yes, we have been preparing for war for several years. I mean, that's the God's honest truth to a degree. But you don't just go back there and flip that light switch and trained sailors come out and new destroyers roll off the yard and everything's filled with ammunition and all this fuel's ready to roll. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Things take time.
Yes. And to that end, one of the things you'll note in the two-ocean Navy bill is that a lot of that capital was allocated for the building of large hulls, carriers, battleships, cruisers. King went to the Navy Board and said, we need to be laying down destroyer escorts, and he was turned away on that. He did not get his wish in that regard. And some of that makes sense in that if I'm going to plunk down a bunch of money now, I'm going to put it into hulls that are as long lead term as possible. I can build destroyer escorts a lot more quickly than I can an Essex-class carrier. What that means is that in 1942, we're in scramble mode, and FDR has got this notion that we're going to build a bunch of these little 168-foot long sub chasers, and that's going to be the magic bullet that's going to get rid of all the boogie subs. Not in North Atlantic, it's not. That's just way too small a haul. A destroyer is actually kind of a bad platform for anti-submarine warfare because it's a bigger ship. It is optimized for speed rather than sea keeping. It's a fuel hog. Really, the best kind of design really is what the British would call a sloop, we would call a destroyer escort. It's something a touch smaller, about a 300-foot hull, a little bit beamier, that's a better sea boat. It's less heavily armed as well. You don't need 5-inch guns to go after a surface U-boat. A pair of 3 or 5 inchers will do just fine. Anyway, we just don't have the right mix of ships in 1942. It's really not going to be until the end of 1943 that those hulls are going to start coming off. And some of that's honestly FDR's fault, not King's.
It all starts with an idea, a spark of curiosity that bubbles your creativity. Once a year, RIT invites you to explore and create alongside us. To join our celebration of novel ideas and dynamic performance.
Hey, look at you guys talking about ASW like experts. I really impressed, guys.
Thank you.
I got nothing to add except I do want to say that the bosses of the Fortune Mariners Okay. For a long time, it was more maybe throughout the Civil War years, we lost more marching mariners than we did Navy SEALers.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. If you look at percentage casualties, the Merchant Marine has one of the highest percentage casualties of any of the American service branches. I mean, when you start getting submarine force and Air Force, their casualties are pretty damn serious. They're higher. But the Merchant Marine were no slouch. They suffered. So
That's a good shout out. Go ahead, Seth.
I was going to say, before anybody comments on what John started to say when he sent me text about the outpatient log, everybody do the ETO, do the ETO. So we talked about it. We're not doing the ETO. We're not doing the Battle of the Balls. I can talk about it days.
see, British line isn't really ETO. It's Eastern Fleet.
We will eventually do the Battle of the Atlantic. Yeah, we are, but it ain't coming anytime soon. So we're on that right.
Well,
Go.
go ahead. All right.
Well, John told me on it. It's John's fault.
I appreciate the plug. Just gotta put a plug. Russell Rothberger, my grandfather, was a merchant marine out there during Torpedo Junction, I never told this story, but he dropped off soldiers at Guadalcanal. So pretty cool. So you gotta put a plug. All right, Jens. Hello. I know there's been a lot of talk about the issues of the MK1 torpedo, but I still have a question. Was the magnetic trigger ever fixed making the... What I said? Sorry. Was the magnetic trigger ever fixed making the torpedo a keel breaker, or was they just using the impact triggers throughout the war? Thanks.
It was the latter. In order to fix it, they really did need to know more about the actual variance in magnetic force in various parts of the world. Because what was happening is the magnetic field at the Earth was saturating the magnetic influence exploded in some places. And that was just very niche science in those days. And so the COs were just instructed to not use the magnetic exploder.
I agree with that.
There you go.
Always learning. Always learn. I assume that the Mark 48 ad cap has got a little bit better ability in that regard.
Yes, we flew satellites in the early 70s to map the magnetic field of the Earth with great precision, as we used it for our ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, because the magnetic influences of various gravitational force bodies has a very big effect on the trajectory of long-range missiles. So, we need to know which of
Got it. Okay. Always learning.
My question is about the rapid advance of U.S. forces in the final 18 months of the war. Is the quick advance better understood as a collapse of the Japanese military, or due to the high tempo of U.S. forces that kept the Japanese on their back foot? Thanks for all you guys do, Matt.
Yes.
He's right. You got too great on the gas.
It's interesting, you look at the end of 1943, and I talk about this in one of the presentations that I do for the World War II Museum trips. I mean, if you look at the actual advance in 1943 up the Solomons and up the coast of New Guinea, it's like 260 miles or something like that up the Solomons. I don't know, I can't remember the exact number, but there were people, there were wags that were pointing out, that at this rate, we're not going to be in Tokyo before 1961. Well, what's going on sort of behind the scenes of 1943, I think, is there's a shift in what the Russians would call the correlation of forces, and that there's a lot of, just stuff that's kind of out of sight that nobody really thinks about, but the maturation of American logistics, the creation of the service squadrons that are going to be able to do underway replenishment, that sort of thing, and also the service squadrons that are going to be able to set up bases in places like, Majuro and Ulithi and those sorts of things. The maturation of American pilot training programs, the fielding of new second-generation fighters in the form of the Hellcat and the Corsair. So it's this sort of multivariate thing that just all comes together in this really nice package for us in the beginning of 1944. Simultaneously, I feel like the Japanese have been just straining just to kind of keep these two campaigns going in New Guinea and in the Solomons. They're at the edge of their resources, and at the beginning of 1944, a lot of the wheels start coming off. And the result is this sort of dramatic transformation in terms of just the velocity of American op tempo and how quickly we're able to penetrate into the Central Pacific. That's my analysis.
No, you're 100% right, because if you go back to the episodes, Calvin, Montero, which built with four, I think, and we made something like that, and we made a big to-do about it, because yes, it's the kickoff of the Central Pacific Drive, which wins the war, but it's, as you said, it's the maturation of the American military machine. This goes back to what I just said just a few minutes ago. When Pearl Harbor's hits, we don't just flip the switch on, carriers come out. It doesn't work like that. It took a long time to build those ships. So when you see Operation Galvanic off in November 1943, and even just a little bit before that, you see the Bunker Hill, like you see Enterprise come back from the yard. You got all these Cleveland class cruisers popping up like freaking weeds in your yard. You've got Fletcher class DD. You've got all this stuff going up. Indiana, Massachusetts, Alabama, South Dakota, both all over Carolina class,
Which was paid for by the Two Ocean Navy bill that was passed in July of 1940. So, yeah.
Right. All these things are now making their way to the Pacific for the very first time. And, the slog from the Solomons, and that's exactly what it was, and up through New Guinea, and that's exactly what that was. It was a slog. But you can do what you can with what you have. And if you look at the revolve carrier, we talked about Jonathan, it was recovered from slavery, and that was right. And it was just two of us. And Halsey sent two carriers down there. He sent Princeton and he sent Sarah down there.
Yeah.
Because that's all he had.
Sarah's Day in the Sun. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. That's her one time to shine. But that's all he had. He didn't have any heavy cruisers to send down because they all got shot up or something while now. And the ones that were still around were, oh, by the way, up in Northern Nimitz. So, I mean, there's things to do. In 1944, we had enough things to do, multiple things at one time.
Yep.
In late 1943, we simply didn't. We just didn't. And everything that was being built, everything that was going up north to Nimitz, that was going in the Central Pacific Drive, which came something Calvin and terrible. So,
Good stuff. All right, this one is from Nicholas D. I do not know. I've never heard this. So you guys, I'm going to put you guys to the test. Were there ever any conversations or diary entries from higher-ranking generals or politicians during the long, dark spring of '42 where the U.S. would have been forced or thought about negotiations with the Japanese? Thanks for the podcast. Look forward to it every week.
Not. I'll throw it to my friends here, but not to my knowledge. Bill and John, the only time surrender is ever talked about, that's not even surrender, it's on Guadalcanal when they tell Vanderbilt, hey, you might have to go up into the hills, and fight when the things are really hitting the fan. But that's the only time. And even then, it was very brief for Vanderbilt.
And that was surrender as much as it was guerrilla warfare.
Correct.
I haven't seen anything like that in all of the 1942 work that I have done. Although I will say that there were a lot of people during that year who were, no one had a clue what the outcome of the war was going to be. That there were a lot of people saying that Eisenhower has this beautiful quote that no one in their hearts and minds can recall the fears and worries of those days. It was a really black time, and so I think that there were a lot of people that were kind of slogging along, like, I don't know how this thing is going to turn out. It's a dumpster fire right now. There was never any talk of surrender that I have seen, but there were certainly a lot of people that were extremely concerned about what the trajectory of the war looked like at the beginning of '42. It was bad.
That's an episode in and of itself right there. Because, you could talk about that. You say, I'd say from January till, well, the whole year, really, frankly, until November.
It's still different.
It's a coin flip. Yeah, really, it's a coin flip, and nobody. I mean, I think obviously we know, but I mean nobody. Vandergrift didn't know. He knew he could hold out the front how long. Is he going to be? Is he going to be? Is the Enterprise going to get hit by a submarine? He can go get patched up after seeing it. So nobody knows. He's going to be without a care. There's so much doubt that goes into 42, and then after Guadalcanal, after the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the November 15th battle, that's things start to kind of start to go.
Well, and the same is true on other fronts as well. You can definitely find quotes from the Soviets that, we are extremely concerned about what is going on in Stalingrad at this point. So, we look back at Stalingrad now, and it's like, well, they get fixed the 4th Panzer armies with these huge haymakers, which seems obvious in hindsight, but of course they're going to win at Operation Uranus, and brother, it ain't so. I mean, every time the Russians have tried some sort of a mechanized offensive, places like Kharkov have just been disastrous failures, that have put 400,000 guys in POW camps. I mean, there's no assurance on the part of the Soviets that the military reforms that they had put in place, really starting since July of 1941, were in fact going to coalesce into a package of capabilities that would allow them to go toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht. And I would argue that it's really not until Christmas Eve, 1942, is when the 2nd Guards Army drops the hammer on Monstein's Operation Venture Bitter and just, puts paid to this whole notion of doing a rescue mission up to Paulus and 6th Army in Stalingrad. It's really not until then that you can definitively say that Operation Uranus has in fact succeeded, and now the Soviets have demonstrated the Red Army has the moxie to go toe-to-toe offensively with the Wehrmacht. This, as Seth says, this really doesn't coalesce until the very end of 1942.
Except earning a degree would keep me in demand, but some degrees are more valuable than others. Take cybersecurity. There were over 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs globally in 2021 alone. Stay in demand. Earn your cybersecurity degree from WGU.
We got John going there, man.
Yeah.
John started going on the globe.
Something. Yep.
All right, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, John, so forgive me. Is there any update on whether the IJN destroyer hunting the USS Nautilus was indeed the IJN, or is it a Russian? John had mentioned at least once that we were told we got that wrong, as if that was a squadron leader and less likely to hunt subs. Regards, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. No, I've got nothing new for you. This is kind of scuttlebutt that came to me from Tony Tully, because Tony, of course, is still deep in the weeds on all this stuff. But you've heard basically what we got at this point. That there's this division that since Arashi is a squadron commander, that she would not have been tasked with keeping Nautilus's head down. It would have been another ship in that Desron, but I don't know which one.
Okay.
I'll ask Tony, though. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, write that down, Joe.
All right.
Here's a hypothetical, guys. Let's mix it up a little bit. We know that the Japanese utilized the sword on a wide scale, whether versus military or civilian. But Jay's question from Cincinnati is, of course, out there, which weapon do you feel killed more people as a whole, the samurai sword or the atomic bomb?
The atomic bomb, easy.
You think so? I actually, my rifles, man.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Artillery, for sure.
Artillery.
Bill, what were the numbers that we spit out for the atomic bomb episode?
It's less than 200,000.
I was going to say, it's less than 200,000.
145,000 miles.
Is it possible to determine causality when it comes to those late cancers? But So I think the worst estimates are just under 200,000. The lowest estimates are something like, let's see, 16,000 for a smart gigantor, and something like 80 or 90 for. Go ahead.
No, it's actually, Hiroshima is around 100,000. Nagasaki is less than that, 35, 40.
So you think the cold steel killed
Okay, well, so here's the only thing that I would say. You've got a war going on in China that ends up killing,
That's why the Nanking and all those battles there are massive amount of Chinese.
and the fact that at the end of that war, there was a prisoner of war exchange. And this is a conflict that just involved millions of soldiers, and the number of POWs that were exchanged by the Chinese and the Japanese mutually was measured in the hundreds, at least according to Rich Frank. And you know that hundreds of thousands of combatants were taken prisoners by both sides, and guess what? They killed them all. And a lot of those, I would argue, probably were beheaded, at least on the part of the Japanese. So I think you can make a credible argument that I'm just doing.
I mean, I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. Yeah, for sure. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying, I hate to speculate on something like this, especially something as gruesome as this. But I mean, again, if you're going to be killing a bunch of prisoners, you're not going to be chopping two in the head. I'm not saying they did, because we all know they did.
You'd shoot them.
You got to shoot them. So, and I mean, you talk about like the Ring of Manila and all that stuff, which was a horror show, and obviously, there were a couple of. I remember James Scott talking about there were a couple of houses, one specific, and I can't. They called it.
I know his house. I know his house.
I don't remember the name of the street, but they called it the whatever street, Death House.
Yeah.
And there was some jackass on the second floor just lopping heads off all day long, like a damn human guillotine. So I mean, and they were talking, and I remember one of the survivors said something like there were like a couple hundred bodies down there.
Yes, they were dropping to the floor for Americans.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know if that's hard to say.
So guys, I'm going to be quite cool first. Something in the world will make me fire. So say ice. When I taste a desire, I hold the nose tree or fire. If I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for drug destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. What does it matter?
Yeah. Fair enough. I do want to bring it back around and to say artillery is a big killer.
The king of battle.
King of battle.
King of the battle.
All right, Commodore. Why is it that some submarines, such as the Wahoo, had success early in the Pacific War despite the high failure rate of the infamous Mark 14 torpedo? Were there factors as tactics that mitigated the torpedo problem for these subs? Also, do we have a reliable estimate of the failure rates on the torpedo? Thank you for the time in creating this outstanding podcast. Shoda.
Manage money as a family with the Venmo Teen account, available for ages 13 to 17.
This is Wix Studio, built to meet any brief. When your project calls for bold creativity, design freely on Figma and seamlessly move to Studio, where your vision can take shape. Wix Studio, built for the way you create.
So, honestly, we kind of alluded to this, maybe we said it in plain English, that the glancing blows were more effective as far as the exploder goes than the well set up shots. Right, so if you try to shoot, you're aiming at the intercept point and you shoot so that you're going to hit a 90-degree angle. Those exploders, the pins, firing pins, would shear and the torpedo would explode. But if you're in a bit of a stern chase and the torpedo impacts at more of an acute angle, the firing pins didn't shear off and you would get a better detonation. You get a detonation more often. So the failure rate is something like 80% because a lot of these guys were setting up their shots for doctrine. The guys who didn't set up their shots for doctrine were generally the more aggressive guys. They say, screw it, I'm shooting anyway. And that is exactly the attitude exhibited by one W. Washington Morgan. And so, yes, some of these guys had incredible success rates. It wasn't good in spite of the fact they weren't setting up the shots right rather than, so
That was good. Yes, actually. Yeah.
almost accident. And so the more vessel guys they could succeed, but they weren't sure when they were succeeding. He knew that the torpedoes were blowing up. Yes, Seth, you got something?
I do, and I think it's also, I mean, this sounds very elementary, but I think it's true. It's the luck of the draw in terms of the batch of fish. Because there's the episode when Morton goes into the Sea of Japan for the first time.
Right.
And I think he sinks one ship. Yeah, it's because his torpedoes suck. And I mean, this is much Morton. So you know the dude ain't firing from 10 miles away. You know he's going to hit some of these guys or kills them or tries to. And he's got crappy torpedoes and he's just got a bad batch. And that's when he comes back to Pearl. And he's like, Columbia explodes. And in Charlie's office, it literally starts buzzing, going bananas. To the point where Charlie Lockwood said, "You need to go home." You might need to go home. And of course, he acquiesces and lets Mush go out one more time. Of course, what happens. But it's that batch of fish that he had. You may remember, but I think he only said one ship. One ship. That ain't the damages one, but I mean,
Again, here we go. In the Sea of Japan, where the Japanese weren't expecting you could set up the shot better. And that's what set him on. Is you had more time, you could be more delicate, you could be more intentional. And those were the torpedoes that failed. So,
Okay. Cool. Good answer, guys. Good answer. All right, Greg's got a question. He had heard on another YouTube channel, quote,
don't watch any other YouTube channels. What's wrong with you?
Always learning.
Always learning. So Greg he's asking a legitimate question. He's taking it to he's seen some JV crap on YouTube. He's bringing it to the expert set. Okay? All right. On a YouTube channel called What is Going On with Shipping? Battle of Lake Gulf Logistics and What Ifs, 80th Anniversary of Largest Naval Battle in History.
That's a great channel, by the way. That's Sal Mercagliano's channel, and it's a great channel. Anyway, go on.
Okay, so maybe it's not Jesus McKay.
No, Sal, good.
That Taffy Creek was 50 miles west of where the task force should have been located on October 25th. Is there any truth to this? I haven't been able to find anything either way, and if I think it's true or I think it opens a lot of questions. Thanks, Greg.
I mean, without pulling up the map, I have no idea. Clue. I don't. Sorry. Bill, do you have any clue?
And this is where I'm putting my plug again. Sal knows some stuff. That channel is great, and he's done a number of fascinating presentations just on the first fast oilers of the Pacific. I mean, that dude knows his stuff. So I'm inclined to say that he's on there.
I have heard, without confirming, I have heard that is indeed the case. That Taffy 3 was relatively out of position. How far? I don't have the pretty clue. I don't have any idea.
Okay. Next one, my boy G-Mac from Australia. He had a series of questions last time we did this. How do they make the naval guns fire actively when the ship is constantly rolling? When a ship is static, they roll even more. Were they just sitting in the water static when giving boostal support? Artillery mortars use stakes, etc. How does naval gun get registered? I believe initially planes were launched to help walk fire on enemy vessels. Did they happen all the time? So go ahead and give us science.
The bottom line is that these analog fire control systems were incredibly sophisticated, and they were...
Life is expensive. Tools don't have to be. Whatever you do, do it for less at Harbor Freight.
What happens at Hungry Meals? This happens. Lego with Deco.
They were always slaved up to a gyroscope that was in the ship that was keeping constant track of well, how am I healing and, yawing and doing all that stuff? What is the ship's motion? And they are factoring that into the solution that's being generated for the turrets. And so the elevation of the gun barrels and all that stuff, in many cases what would happen would be that the fire control system itself would interrupt the firing of the weapons. So the weapons officer would pull the trigger and say, okay, I want to fire the guns. But the system would wait until the ship rolls the proper angle, and then it would know that, okay, now my barrels are lined up with where my solution says they should be. Now I fire my guns and things like that. So the bottom line is that we had thought all of that stuff through and were reasonably able to compensate for the motion of the ship. The other thing, some of these systems were sophisticated enough that they were taking into account things like humidity, the temperature, even the Coriolis effect. Because when you fire these guns, the Earth continues spinning underneath you as that is happening. These systems would compensate for the Coriolis effect. So we're talking real four-dimensional chess kind of systems here.
So just think about this. Everything you just said, but like times 10, like really in-depth stuff. That's what Willis Lee and Harvey Walsh and Jonas Platt, all those Glenn Davis and all those guys are sitting around smoking cigarettes in Willis Lee's sea cabin on Washington at a gun club, and they're having these conversations. That's what punches them up at night.
Yep. Yeah, all of the stuff.
Badass.
What's the effect of my barrel liner wear? The liner on these guns is only good for 100 plus rounds or something like that. If I'm on round 75, what does that do?
What does that affect? How does that affect the
Christ.
of this
These
round?
guys are so deep in the weeds. Anyway.
That's literally good.
Some of these rifles that were stabilized as well, what we would call today accelerators. So yeah, people think that the computer didn't come into existence until the 1960s. With the IBM main, not true. Analog computers were still computers, folks, and they were very sophisticated. The ones we used for the torpedo data computer in a submarine, all these things, right? Those were computers. They used servo.
Years.
You crank them instead of with inputs and things like that. And so they were kind of Stone Age computers, but they could be working. Yeah.
And again, throwing it back to Willis Lee, we're all a fan of Willis Lee. But just imagine these conversations. For a mathematical fool like me, that makes me sweat.
Very
Dude, seriously. And these guys, I forgot when Edwin Hoover was like the man. They're all getting
MIT.
Yeah, the MIT freaking grade for crying out loud, and they're talking about this, like we're sitting here talking about this.
Right. And they were doing calculus on some of these solutions, right? You didn't have to do calculus to fire the gun. What we were doing is they were taking, it's called numerical analysis, right? They were doing the calculations and then sending it off to have engineers build machines that mimic the calculations, right? And then they would have, they call them Jesus factors, because that's probably exactly what they called them. They would tweak the calculations as they detected error, and then change the machine a bit to match, so that
or change their doctrine a little bit too. Mentally they'd be like, okay, the machine can't compensate for this, but I know that I'm going to notch it down, 0.5 degree, and that's or whatever,
To that end, and I don't know the exact date, but it's like a few days before the battleship fight off Guadalcanal. And I say, maybe a week, maybe 10 days. And John, you may remember this, that Bill, you too, Lloyd Muskie, of course, is assistant gunnery officer on USS Atlanta. Yeah. And and he's acting as, she is acting as the target for USS Washington. As 56 is calibrating her main battery. And of course, this is all Willis Lee saying, I want these things to be able to split somebody's hair from 10 miles away. And then, Edwin Hoover and Platt and all these guys, Platt's 5 inches, but still they're all doing their thing. and Mustin is watching these rounds drop in Atlanta's wake, just boom, 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 boom. He makes a comment. He says something like, if anybody messes with this battleship, they're going to be in for a bad day, or something along those lines. And of course, they do.
Yeah, exactly.
And they are.
Anyway, all right, beating that to the box.
So,
No, we haven't. We can keep going on that.
well, that was some geeking out.
I got a good follow-up question for Patrick in regards to this. We're taking another step. He says, thanks for the great work. My question is simply this. Who thought to tie radar to fire control systems for naval guns? As you stated, Admiral Willis Lee was an earlier adopter, but did he come up with it, or did somebody else? Thanks for the great podcast.
So there's a whole team of guys that do this, but it's actually none other than Sweet Monson, who's the main driver who's the main driver of a lot of this stuff in 1940. He's not the only one, obviously, but he's the main pusher, if you will, of radar-directed naval gunfire. He's the guy that's pushing a lot of this stuff and is getting a lot of this stuff done. Yes, he was one of the early adopters for sure, but it was Sweet Monson was the main arbitrator in 1940, 41.
Yes, I will not miss the opportunity to point out that a submariner came up with the idea for the Doolittle raid. Army airplanes or Navy aircraft carriers, and a submariner came up with the idea of tying radar to gunnery on surface ships. I see the criminality here, guys. What would that mean?
I think it's Dolphins, Bill. I think it's Dolphins. Sweet Monson is just... Somebody asked when we were in San Diego, guys, somebody asked if there was a biography.
Problem too. Remember, he solved the torpedo problem.
And he developed VTVs. Very hard part. If there was a biography that did you have to be written?
Sweet Monson.
Sweet Monson.
Yeah.
Good point. All right, let's keep it simple. Brian B. wants to know, did the kamikaze dive bombers or medium bombers, did they carry rear gunners or full crews when they went on their missions?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Well, the last episode we recorded this past Tuesday, the Poetic Two goes to me. The Poetic Two with a full crew.
Right, he did.
Great
Why did I die alone? When I could bring two other guys with me.
Right. No, I think that points to the fact that, I think we probably crewed these planes up fully. I mean, the majority of kamikazes were single seat. The Zero, honestly, is the most... maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the evidence would tend to suggest that, if you're flying a Val out there, you can put two guys in it.
Because, I mean, like, you're off Okinawa, Laffey, and Hugh Hadley, and Evans. We did episodes
Some of those were
guys.
craters and that kind of stuff.
Some of them were, but a lot of the ones that, like, Pele, Hugh Hadley, and Laffey were
Chills. Chewies.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
That's the
And
mindset.
they were Val's out the Watsu.
Okay.
All right. Moving on, I got a special shout out for the Commodore. This is from Cecil. He says he's an USS Indianapolis family member, my father's cousin, and the man who I am named after is Radio Man Arthur Cecil Trotter, who was lost in the sinking. Special thanks to Captain Toady and all he has done. So a shout out to the Commodore, and his question is, in the recent kamikaze-related episodes, several inferior Japanese admirals have been mentioned in relation to Japan's decision process to proceed with organized suicide attacks. What was the Imperial Japanese involvement in this? Were they in the decision process, the planning, execution, if any? Regards again, Cecil.
Nothing like a little confidence boost to ease you back into the dating scene. Aspen Dental specializes in dentures and implants made just for you. Right now, get 25% off, helping our patients look...
Go ahead, John.
Onishi, Admiral Onishi Takajiro is, I think, sort of, father of the company. He's the dude that, is in command of his first air fleet that's on in the Philippines. He's the overall commander of the Philippine.
Real-time mixture, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, no, it's all good. And he's the guy that ends up sauntering into the headquarters of this one air unit, and ends up, picking these guys, Lieutenant Secchi and so forth, to go out and do that first mission. And so it seems from the scholarship that there sort of
It is first. It is first air fleet.
Thank you. That there's kind of an organic upwelling, a number of different people within the Imperial Navy and also the Army too are like, the goose is cooked after the Battle of Phil C. How are we going to make lemonade out of lemons? And are moving towards this notion of sure hit, sure death tactics. But I think you can say that Onishi is really sort of the guy that has a high enough level rank to kind of promulgate that as an official sort of policy. And it's clear, as soon as Secchi does his thing, wipes out San Lo, that Onishi immediately doubles down on that and says, this stuff works, we're going with it.
And those to be clear, complete here, these conversations about special attack tactics.
Special attack.
They're held in front of the Emperor. So it's, he absolutely gave credence to and de facto approval of these tactics, these methods, right? So this wasn't made by some low-level dude. The Emperor, in fact, towards the end, one of the episodes that will have aired by the time this book does, we will have talked about the fact that people were discussing in front of the Emperor that we don't even think special tactics will work to defeat the invasion. Right, the Emperor himself, right?
Says, I no longer have faith in special attack tactics. That's the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the discussions on the evening of the 10th of August. So, but the Emperor is perfectly aware of this stuff.
All right, moving on. This is for John. John, in Shattered Sword, maybe you've heard of it, you characterize the Japanese Navy as, quote, over-officered, yet the great majority of its pilots were petty and warrant officers. Can you explain all this? Morgan from Pacific Grove, California wants to know.
That's a great question. If you look at the evolution of the Japanese air service, the Navy's air service, I guess I should say, they become aware that they're not going to have, that their Navy just isn't big enough to put officers in the cockpits of all of their aircraft, particularly when you start looking at things like their land-based bombers, like the G3ML and then later on the Betty. I mean, these are 7-person machines. Is it gonna have to be an officer that got the controls of every one of those things? It doesn't scale. And so they started relatively early a whole sort of separate branch of flight training that was oriented towards kids, really demonstrated some aptitude for this sort of thing. And so they would get these boys into the service, in some cases age 16, 17, and start bringing them up through the ranks. It turns out that a lot of these non-commissioned officers, petty officers and whatnot, were some of the best tradesmen. There's an episode, I can't remember exactly where in the Battle of Midway that I talk about it. It's like, it's the 0700 attack where the B-26s and VT-8 detached come in. So that's 10 American aircraft come in, and they just get absolutely shellacked by the Japanese cap. I mean, 5 of the 6 TBFs go down, 2 of the 4 B-26s go down. All of those dudes behind the stick on the Combat Air Patrol, by and large, they were all petty officers, and they were very experienced and fought in China. And so, the bottom line is that unlike the Americans who tended to put officers in pilot positions only, there was definitely an initiative on the part of the Japanese to be able to have petty officers as well. There you go.
Good explanation, John. Concerning the Battle of Surigao Strait, why did the destroyer torpedo attacks have such a great success and the multiple PT attacks earlier? Was there difference in the torpedo use, such as range or speed? I enjoyed the episode.
Yes.
And the relaxed relationship you guys have. Look forward to new ones all the time, Steve and A.
Phil, you want to start?
I'm not relaxed.
You are drinking water. It's not as relaxed as we are, but it's.
Yeah, no, I'll punt.
So the PT boats, first of all, a lot early post-war histories of Battle of Surigao Strait give a lot of credit to the PT boats for doing a lot of things, and really they, as we know now, they did not. And the reason for that mainly is the fact that there's a small craft, it's an unstable platform, number one. Number two, they got to get, like, as I said, I got to kiss you before I kill you kind of thing, and they got to get super, super close. And when they're attacking too, they're being shot at plywood crap, all the marine grade plywood, whatever the hell, mahogany, whatever the hell it is, wooden boats that are being shot at by, destroyers and cruisers and battleships, and things kind of go haywire, so you got to point your boat to where you want your torpedo to hit. As
And it's a smaller torpedo.
Yes, it is.
It's 17.7 inch. They're basically using the airdropped torpedo
Yes, they are.
as
Yes, they are.
opposed to the Mark 15, which is the standard, or is it the 13? I mean, now I'm spacing.
I think it's 15.
15, thank you. Which
Survey
is,
ship.
yeah, survey ship, much longer.
But again, with a PT, you have to point the vessel at the target, which sounds like that's going to make it more accurate, because I'm driving here, that means I'm looking in here. No, it ain't, dude, because with a DD, you can be going this way, you can still be shooting this way. And that's what happens. And the destroyers, first of all, they have a hell of a lot more fish than the PTs do have.
Correct. They have fire control too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a better torpedo.
Yeah.
It is. So the DDs are going to hit, and they're going to hit it, well, not going to hit every time, but they're going to hit a lot more accurately than the PTs. And the PT sailors, God bless them, the hell, I mean, they were incredibly brave to ride on those damn things. But, and there were only very few certain circumstances where the PT boats were actually very effective at anything in terms of ship killing. In the Pacific.
The only thing I would add to that is that, again, the torpedo only works if the target doesn't sink, because it doesn't maneuver. And you can see, and like a submarine, you can see this thing coming. So they're small. So mosquitoes, exactly right. You're hoping they don't see you. But if they do see you when they maneuver, you miss. And you've got to be really close, which means counterparts may be really accurate. So it's very, very risky.
And then two, a PT does not and cannot fire a spread of torpedoes. Whereas a destroyer can. And that is a huge difference, Bill. You know this far better than I. You fire 1, 2, 3, 4 as opposed to 6. You're going to get more hits. Yeah, whatever. You're going to get more hits.
All right, so here we go. Captain Tony and Seth, friends, a friend introduced me to your podcast. I'm so glad you did. I absolutely love it. Probably too much. As listening to it has probably decreased my work proficiency over the last couple of weeks. I just toured through season 1. I have a quick question in regards to episode 112 about the lead-up to Operation Watchtower. In that episode, you discussed the advanced structure for the operation, and that Admiral McCain was in charge of land-based naval air assets supporting the invasion prior to Henderson Field becoming operational. Where did those aircraft come from? From what I can tell, the U.S. didn't have any operational airfields anywhere near Guadalcanal in August of 42. I look forward to your response. This is from John H. He's a Naval Academy grad, 93, and he says something afterwards about Navy and Army and all that stuff, but I'm not going to repeat that on it.
By the way, Bill, I like your shirt. I have that shirt. I think I bought that shirt when you bought that shirt.
You did indeed.
That's it. So, all right, so most, not all, but most of the land-based air support for Guadalcanal at that time, in the very early stages of the campaign, is coming out of Espiritu Santo, and they're mostly B-17s and PBYs and Hellfire. What else? There's a layover, John, and Bill, when they're coming out. Yes.
You killed me.
Are they? Yeah. Yeah, because they're coming out and there's a layover before, like, the fighters. not Jonathan.
San Cristobal? No,
Maybe.
But they're delivering some of those fighters. Are they using the Long Island to bring some
They
of those
are.
assets?
They're bringing the Marine Corps fighters in there, yes. Yeah,
Right.
Long Island is cat launching Mangram's people and his SBDs, and they're launching John L. Smith's people and their FORS. But there's another echelon coming from Espirito Santo, and I cannot remember for the life of me who the heck they are. Anyway, but they're coming from Espirito Santo to Caledonia.
And then once they get established on Henderson Field, it's not McCain anymore.
Correct.
There you go.
Skyler. Wait,
All right. Dave,
Yeah, by the way, before we get on that, we want to know precise detail. I want you a metric, how much your proficiency has dropped, okay? By watching us. We need that data for our data. Yeah, exactly. Our data. Our not hand waving. My productivity has dropped. No, we want percentages. Are you 30% less proficient or 20%? We need that. Thank you.
moving on. Dave L. Seth. Here's Seth and Bill and John.
No mention of Sean in that, but
Who's track? My favorite ship from the Pacific War is the USS Enterprise CB6. Wow, how about that?
My man.
My question is about her time testing the F-4U Corsair in early 43. Specifically, how long was the testing period and the thoughts on the incident eliminator by pilots like Sweet Benison and the Big E's deck crew?
Okay, so how long was it? I don't know.
All right, moving on to the next
What?
one.
So that is I knew Sweet very, 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 very well. And of course, he was the first naval aviator to land an F-4U on the deck of the CD-6. And there's video footage of that. He just plops it right down. So that whole theory of the British had to teach us how to land a carrier, how to land an F-4U on a carrier, it's a bunch of malarkey. Nobody taught Sweet Benison how to land an F-4U on an Enterprise. He just plopped it down because he was a badass. And that's generally it's true. Now, he was the hottest stick in the Navy at the time, and he was. And everybody knew it. But how long did it go? I don't know. But I remember the man telling me to my face, he said, as soon as he got in that cockpit and launched from the Enterprise, it's like, this is the baddest fighter in the air.
yeah.
And we need these, and we need these now.
And
He was all... Oh, yeah. No, of course, it was incredibly awesome. But he was an early advocate of getting the F-4U to the fleet as fast as he possibly could. He was also a guy, and not to get too sidetracked because I know we're running slow, who advocated that the SBD, if given more guns and taken more weight out, could have been a good fighter because he shot down the three aircraft of the Dauntless.
Would you guys consider that the best fighter of the Pacific?
Oh yeah. Corsair, you bet.
By far. Certainly the sexiest fighter of the Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, how do you want to measure it? I mean, in terms of raw airframe performance characteristics, yes, it's better than the Hellcat. I mean, you have to say. But the Hellcat is a better fighter from a mass production standpoint if you've got a whole bunch of ensigns that you want to bring home. I mean,
Yes.
the Corsair is a hotter machine, and it's a little more finicky too. So
I think the proof is in the pudding, and said the Hellcat, granted, it was replaced by the Bearcat, but the Corsair keeps rolling all the way through Korea.
right.
So,
Okay,
there you go.
another follow-up here. Just go with me. How would you compare it to the Mustang?
What, the Corsair?
God, we've gone into this. I look at the Mustang is just like this. I look at that as like the frat boy fighter. You know, everybody loves the Mustang. It's got this super long range. Man, for my money, I love the Corsair. It's just it's damn good. It's got better firepower. I would argue. Of course, my favorite.
They got 650s. They both got 650s.
No, but a lot of the Mustangs get down to 4.
If your bath has seen a lot of life, nobody gives it new life like Bath Fitter. Whatever shape your bath is in, Bath Fitter will transform it. When it's time to give your bath new life, it just fits. Go to bathfitter.com to book your free consultation.
Step into Wix Studio, the platform for agencies and enterprises, and turn website layouts into an art form.
No, the other way around. Yeah, the early Mustangs got 4 Bs.
Oh, they went up to
The B models got 4, and the Ds have 650s.
With regards here, is my underlying inclination. I love P-47, and I love planes like the Hawker Typhoon. I just love the big, brutal, 850s kind of fighters. That's my bougie. So
Okay. Now,
Was the Warhawk in the day.
so I've got another one, and this one's for John.
I got to chime in here. All I can say is, here's the Mustang. I've never driven the Corsair.
Are you flown a Mustang?
No.
line driven.
I'm talking about a Ford Mustang.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm a General Motors guy. I don't want to hear it.
That's not what you're talking about. Okay.
And by the way, I've flown a Mustang. Just saying, and it's cool. So,
I'm not saying it's a bad plane. I'm just like, I don't know.
Okay.
hey man.
Yeah, go.
I've got a question for John. Now, Seth already knows the answer to this question, and I'm just going to tell you, John, before I ask. Seth got this question wrong. Okay?
What's the question?
Well, just you bear with me here, okay? John, what World War II plane shot down the most enemy planes?
I'm going MU-109.
Negative.
That was my answer too, by the way. I'm just saying. Okay, my answer too.
B-17.
That was Seth's answer, and it's the wrong answer.
What is the right answer?
The right answer is the Falcon.
The 190.
The 190.
Yeah, you were in the right area. All right, here we go. Sean Q said,
I'll push back on that. I mean, if you think about destroying enemy aircraft, though, you think about just the butchery that happened on the Eastern Front at the beginning of Barbarossa. A lot of those Russian planes were destroyed on the runway and that sort of thing, and the majority of that was taking place as a result of the 109. Anyway,
95% of the mistake. That was my guess too. Was 105. Just saying.
yeah, okay. So are we?
Don, it's okay. We still love you. We still love you, John.
This is why my dog's named after Gun the Roll. 190s. But go ahead.
All right, Sean Q asks, with the exception of Kamikaze, did the Japanese come up with any strategical innovation during the war that caused us serious difficulties? Or were most of the difficulties in the end really our own fault in not being prepared in time for the Pacific War to kick off? Thanks, guys. Keep up the good work. Tuesdays are my favorite for us. Okay, me and the cat. Go ahead.
Long last torpedo, man. You know, that obviously caused us significant difficulties in the night fighting around Guadalcanal and up through the Solomons. This is a weapon system that was not understood by the Americans, although I just made a new friend, a guy named Justin Pike, who is very, very knowledgeable about Japanese ground-based aviation. He's a freak about the Nell, the Betty, and that sort of thing. He just forwarded me a number of pre-war intel estimates that came from our naval attaches in Japan that show that we were aware of the Type 93 torpedo, at least insofar as being aware that Japanese destroyers were carrying 24-inch rather than 21-inch torpedoes. So,
But then we knew the characteristics? Obviously not.
that was the thing. And it's funny because one of these reports that Justin forwarded me, we had a naval attaché that went to the torpedo school near Yokosuka, and like 1935 or 36, and he's asking all sorts of questions. Have you guys experimented at all with larger torpedoes? And then, the Japanese just lie outright to him. But we were aware of what in the report it's called trackless torpedoes, which is an indication of pure oxygen driven torps. No, we didn't have a clue about their performance characteristics. Yeah, and that just bites us in the butt, the Solomons.
So what about the bonsai charge? That kind of took us by surprise too, and I don't think it was lack of preparation. I think it was just a matter of what we call failure of imagination.
I don't know if it took us by surprise, because you got to remember that there are instances of bonsai charges, or air quotes, bonsai charges that occurred in the Philippines in 1941-42. So it wasn't necessarily an unknown tactic. I think any surprises, like, the Marines, especially in General River, Alligator Creek, whatever you want to call it, are sitting there going, "You're really doing this?
Right.
Are you serious? Yeah. You're coming at 37s firing canister and 1917s holding 50 cals too, and you're coming,
Whatever, bro.
whatever you want to do, keep it coming. Keep feeding me belts, because we're going to knock this down right now." I think it was more of a surprise tactic in that I can't believe they're actually doing this.
Right.
The unknown thing, because again, it had happened numerous times in the Philippines in 41, especially late 41, early 42, when they were pushing our people back to Bataan, and it was, it was bad.
I would say just in general, the quality. The high quality of Japan's infantry was a bit of a surprise, certainly to the early war combatants. The British just couldn't deal with these people at all. You look at Yamashita's offensive in Malaya, 25th Army just crushes the British over and over and over again because they just Burma. Yes, Aida's army is the same thing.
I think it's their longevity. Like, these people can subsist on virtually nothing and get something far.
They've made a virtue out of necessity, and that they have terrible logistics, and as a result they travel very, very light, and they are really, really good at fixing attacks from the front while working around your flanks to launch attacks from the rear, or drop roadblocks behind you that will discomfit you. They just bedevil the British over and over again in Malaya and Burma. Sean, to your point. Go, Sean.
Well, I was going to expand on that, just that point. With during the interwar, well, not interwar, but in the 40s, 39, 40, the Japanese developed the jungle school out in Taiwan, and they began understanding how tying yourself mechanized wise in the jungles was not the way to go. They started utilizing mules to be able to infiltrate and get behind lines, because at that time roads were everything. So the Japanese innovation in jungle fights, to drive your point home, John, is how they were able to go all the way through to Singapore and they get into Burma, and they're outflanking the British. And they're like, how are they getting behind this? Because they're using mules and wrapping around them. So their jungle there was, I think.
I want to push back on that, because if you look at the Japanese field manuals of the time, they had very little in the way of official jungle doctrine. I grant you that they had that school in Taiwan, but the majority of the doctrine that the Japanese Army has at the time is developed for Manchuria. They're all about how do we fight the Soviet Army. And I would argue, too, that actually in that early campaign, in Malaya in particular, the Japanese are not going to go on to be shining practitioners of armored warfare, but they use their tanks very, very well in Malaya, Slim River in particular. So they're good at that too. I think that they really have a package that just, if you look at just the force composition, really tanky here. I'm sorry, I'm just fascinated by the Malaya campaign.
I love it.
I was going to say that the Japanese had really good intelligence on what they were going to be up against in Malaya, and so they had just configured 25th Army perfectly in that they had, for the Japanese, had highly mechanized them. They had tons of trucks. They had beefed up its engineering complement so that they were really good at bridge building. They pumped in the 4th and 7th tank regiments so that they had armor when they needed that, And the result is that 25th Army was the most highly mechanized force, I would argue, in Japanese Army history. And it's precisely so that they can fight this 600-mile campaign from the Kra Isthmus all the way down to Singapore. And they've got all the things in the toolkit. They can do the jungle warfare thing But also, if they need to change it up, tanks right in your face.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking of as you guys were talking was, it's not necessarily a strategic tactic that had strategic implications. Was their willingness to conduct horrible atrocities against civilian populations that we had to react, right?
Right.
And that had incredible strategic implications because we had to adapt our methods to the realization that they were going to massacre the population if we didn't do something about it. And that affected timelines, and MacArthur used that very effectively as argument for going back to the Philippines, when he did, right? And so our whole strategic campaign reflected that reality and things like that. And I think that's one of the, from my point of view, another one of those things like we're talking about, John.
Yeah, fair. Great question, showing you had us going there down a rabbit hole. All right, Sherwood wants to know, naval admirals wanted land forces to complete missions in as little time as possible so as not to risk naval personnel and ships. Alan Matt Smith was their land attack dog. How much of Smith's actions were the result of culture and pressure from Nimitz and Halsey to get the job done quickly as opposed to the Army's perception of Smith being an inter-service chauvinist?
That recommended protection for less. Pet armor. Protect and save. Check it out. At Planet Fitness, you can get free fitness training.
We're mixing it up. We're not slowing down.
Checking my form.
55, but yeah, tool is a more politically correct term. So the thing with Holland, with Holland Smith is that he was a jerk. He was a jerk, bottom line. And yes, the Army did things differently than the Marine Corps in the Pacific. That has been shown 1,001 times. But the Army's way was no less effective than the Marine Corps' way of doing things. Quite frankly, it cost less lives than the Marine Corps way of doing things. But what was Holland Smith's actions, or were Holland Smith's actions a result, or his behavior, I guess, a result of God love the Corps. Right. But, he did not take into effect the way that the Army did things. And yeah, maybe there should have been a little more communication here and there, specifically, I'm thinking Saipan, we're all thinking Saipan, let's be real. But it was also Holland Smith who deployed the 27th Infantry Division in such a way that kind of disabled them in the middle of the entire friggin' island because he split their forces in such a way where they could not put everything they needed into the middle of the island. And also, by the way, he gave them the worst terrain in the entire freaking island. The center of Saipan, John, you've been there, I've been there. Bill, you've been to Saipan. I have. The center of Saipan. It's a meat grinder. It's a freaking meat grinder. It's like, and not that the Marines' territory was a flat parking lot, because it was not. They just have ridges on either side. They weren't walking down. And I mean, the thing is I've been critical of Ralph Smith. I personally think that he was probably not the best United States Army general that ever put on the uniform. I think he lacked command presence, but he certainly wasn't helped by Holland Smith in any way, shape, or form. So, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, no, it was just Holland Smith. It's just a jackass. Bottom line, because Roy Geiger does the same kind of thing. Guess what happens? Everything works fine.
All right, jackass is the answer for that question.
All day.
Richard M. from Buffalo, New York wants to know, how did wartime censorship and propaganda shape American public's perception of escalating casualties In 1945, particularly from the battles of Manila, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the kamikaze attacks, and did this betrayal clash with the reality on the ground?
So, oh my goodness gracious, that
Great question.
I don't want to get it's a fantastic question. It's 2 episodes at least. We've talked about this, the home front in World War II and the American side and Japan, by the way. It's such a, there's so much to unpack there. But the thing is this, is that the United States of America thought that everything was peachy keen 24 hours a day. And that war was just, the biggest thing that the United States home front was concerned about was, I don't have enough gas, I can't go buy steak, and where the hell is my next ham coming from? That's all they cared about. They did not care about people in any other way. The only time they did were the big casualty rates, and this is why FDR does what he does after Tarawa. He releases those images of Norm Hatch. Christ, I don't know that. Norm Hatch shoots, or his people shoot those photographs of those dead Marines on Tarawa on video. And FDR says, no, we're going to release this to the public. And then when the American public sees this, they go, oh my God. And he's like, yeah, people are dying. We're worrying about these turkeys. People are dying here. And so the American public citizenry on the home front were so completely out of touch with reality on both sides of the ocean, by the way, that anytime any warrior came home for any length of time, they were appalled at the situation on the American home front, and they literally were like, get me the hell out of here. I want to go back to the goddamn war, because this place is so screwed up, we don't know what the heck's going on anywhere. And that's, I don't want to go down